Millionaire helps desperate mother and discovers a truth that will leave you speechless, disguised as luxury. It was a clear morning in Boulder, Colorado. The cloudless sky reflected the calmness that covered the city, with the sun illuminating the distant mountains and the parks filled with residents enjoying the fresh air. Among them walked Christopher Evans, a man who, in the eyes of others, seemed to have everything. He wore a designer coat and expensive shoes that barely made a sound as his steps touched the ground. However, what others didn't see was the invisible weight he carried. The life of luxury, with all its comforts, couldn't alleviate the growing dissatisfaction inside him. He felt a deep emptiness. In recent years, Christopher had accumulated success. As the owner of a real estate empire, he had built a fortune that allowed him to enjoy anything material he desired. However, as he walked through the park, observing the people around him, something stirred inside him. He noticed couples walking hand in hand, families smiling, children running carefree, and he realized that, despite everything he owned, something was missing. Wealth didn't fill the void he felt. The luxury he was accustomed to had become a superficial reflection of a contentment he could no longer achieve. He tried to understand where he had gone wrong. He had dedicated himself to his business for years, never stopping to think about what truly motivated him. The career that once was his greatest passion now seemed cold and distant. He spent days in meetings and nights reviewing contracts, but at the end of it all, he wondered if it made any sense. There was no longer any spark in his achievements, and the exhaustion he carried wasn't physical, but emotional. Christopher felt trapped in a life he had created himself, but that no longer fulfilled him as it once did. As he walked, Christopher looked up at the sky and wondered if the answer lay somewhere beyond what he could see. Maybe it was in something he had never sought, real human connections, bonds that went beyond business. He questioned why he had never allowed himself to stop and truly observe what was around him. He had spent so much time chasing success that now, with everything he wanted in his hands, he found himself lost. The sun shining on the horizon seemed to mock him, as if to say that despite all his fortune, there was something essential he had never understood. It was then that he saw something that interrupted his thoughts. Across the park, a woman was sitting on a bench, holding a baby stroller. She looked worn out, exhausted. Even from a distance, Christopher noticed that something was wrong. The woman was crying, and the baby in the stroller was sobbing quietly. The image touched him in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, he forgot about himself and his own problems. The suffering of that woman seemed far more immediate, far more real than anything he was feeling. He hesitated, but something inside him made him walk toward her. As he approached, he realized that the woman was even more worn out than he had thought. Her face was wet with tears, and she could barely lift her eyes. Christopher felt a tightening in his chest, a feeling he had avoided for years. He wasn't sure what to say, but he wanted to help. Maybe it was the first time in a long while that he felt a genuine need to do something for someone else. He stopped in front of her and, with a gentle voice, said, "Is everything okay? Can I help in any way?" The woman lifted her gaze, surprised by his approach. She seemed embarrassed to accept help, but too desperate to refuse. Her shoulders were slumped from the exhaustion and pressure of her situation. She looked at Christopher, her eyes still full of tears, and shook her head, as if trying to find the right words. He realized she was alone, with no one to turn to, and for some reason, this affected him deeply. I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "My husband disappeared, and I'm alone with my child. I have no money, nowhere to go." Christopher felt a pain in his chest he couldn't explain. He thought of offering money, as he always did when someone needed help. He was already pulling out his wallet when the woman interrupted him with a firm gesture, though her hands were trembling. "I don't need charity," she said with dignity. "I just need a chance, a job, something that will allow me to take care of my child." Her words echoed in Christopher's mind. She didn't want what he usually offered. She wanted something deeper, and this made him feel strange, as if he had found a part of himself that had long been dormant. Grace, as she introduced herself shortly after, didn't ask for handouts, and it was at that moment that Christopher knew something was changing. In the days that followed, Grace's life began to change. The job that Christopher had offered her was the first opportunity she had in a long time to regain control of her life. She started as a cleaning assistant in one of the luxury buildings he owned. It wasn't a dream job, but it was honest work, and she approached it with dedication. Grace arrived early every day, left her child in the care of a neighbor, and headed to work with a clear purpose to rebuild her life. What mattered most to her was ensuring that her son had a better future, free from the uncertainties she was facing at the moment. The adjustment was not easy. Grace spent hours cleaning offices, organizing rooms, and taking out the trash. The work was physically demanding, and the suspicious looks from the other employees bothered her. Many knew that her hiring had been directly arranged by Christopher, and soon rumors began to spread. Some believed she was there as a special favor, not due to her own merit. She heard whispers in the hallways and felt the critical glances around her as she worked, but she kept her head held high. The path she had chosen wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to keep moving forward. Christopher, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Grace. He observed her from afar, tracking her progress and trying to understand the impact she had had on him. His worldview was changing, but he still couldn't fully grasp what it was. Grace's humility and her strength in the face of adversity made Christopher start to question his own choices. For years, he had solved problems with money and power, but for the first time, he had met someone who didn't want any of that. As Grace adjusted to her new routine, Christopher began to think more about the people who worked for him. He had always focused on results, numbers, and financial goals. Now, he wondered how many of his employees were facing personal struggles similar to Grace's. He started paying more attention to the faces, the stories he didn't know. It was a strange feeling for him, having spent years focused only on his own success. Watching Grace dedicate herself so fully to her work made him realize that perhaps there was much more to the people who worked for him than he had ever imagined. Grace faced daily challenges, but she didn't let them get her down. She came home exhausted, her body aching, but still found time to care for her son and plan for the future. The job was just the first step, and she wanted more. At night, after her son fell asleep, Grace studied. She was determined to learn new skills, to grow professionally, and to ensure that she never again found herself in such a desperate situation. Every day was a small victory, and she believed that, in time, more doors would open. Meanwhile, her co-workers continued to look at her with suspicion. Some made hurtful comments, others simply ignored her. Grace understood that she was being judged because her job had come directly from Christopher, but it didn't bother her as much as it had before. Her effort and dedication would speak for themselves. The only thing that saddened her was seeing that, even in a work environment, people were quick to judge without knowing the full story. However, Grace was determined to change that perception. Christopher monitored Grace's progress from a distance, occasionally requesting reports on her performance, but also making discreet visits to the places where she worked. He noticed that despite the difficulties, Grace stood out. Her commitment to her work was evident, and she faced the obstacles with a quiet strength. This made him admire her courage even more. One day, he asked her supervisor for an evaluation of her performance. "How is she doing?" Christopher asked. "Very well, Mr. Evans. Always punctual. She does her job with care, and she never complains. But there's still some resistance from her colleagues. Many think she was favored," the supervisor replied. Christopher reflected on this. Changing people's attitudes wouldn't be easy, but something about Grace made him want to fight for her. She hadn't asked for privileges. She had asked for a chance, and he wanted to make sure that chance was fair. Her humility, in contrast to the people around her, made Christopher wonder why he hadn't cared before about the others who worked for him. That week, Christopher decided to call Grace in for a conversation. He didn't just want to hear about her performance at work. He wanted to know how she was dealing with the challenges. When she entered his office, he noticed that she was nervous, but he tried to put her at ease. "Grace, how are things?" he asked in a friendly tone. "I'm adjusting," she replied with a shy smile. "The work is hard, but I'm happy to be here. I just need to stay focused and keep doing the best I can." Christopher smiled, impressed by the simplicity and determination in her words. He realized that Grace was willing to overcome any obstacle, and this, in some way, inspired him to become a better leader. As the weeks passed, Grace's work became a tiring but necessary routine. The repetitive tasks of cleaning didn't intimidate her, as she saw them as a stepping stone to something greater. However, the real challenge remained the interactions with her coworkers. The prejudice, which presented itself in the form of looks and whispers, was a constant battle. Every day was a test of patience and strength. There were moments when Grace felt like giving up, but the thought of her son and the future she wanted for him kept her going. The hurtful comments didn't stop. Some coworkers treated her with indifference, while others excluded her from conversations. Grace knew her hiring had been viewed with suspicion from the start, but the prejudice she faced was deeper than that. To many, she was just another desperate woman who had received a special favor. They didn't see the effort she put into every task, nor did they know about the internal battle she fought every day to maintain her dignity. Despite the difficulties, Grace stood firm. Her worth wasn't in the opinions of others, but in the work she accomplished. She arrived early, did her tasks with dedication, and went home exhausted but proud of what she had achieved that day. She wasn't just cleaning offices. She was building a future, brick by brick. On the hardest nights, when fatigue threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered her son's smile and found the strength to continue. Life was still hard, but for the first time, Grace felt she had control over her destiny. While Grace faced challenges at work, Christopher was also going through a transformation. He, who had once viewed his company as a money-making machine, now began to see the people behind the numbers. Grace's dedication made him rethink how he managed his business. There were hundreds of employees like her, people who worked hard every day but whose stories he didn't know. For the first time, Christopher began to question his own priorities and what success really meant. One morning, Christopher decided to visit one of the buildings where Grace worked. He wanted to see her in action, to understand how she was handling the work and the daily challenges. When he arrived, he found Grace cleaning the floor of a hallway. She didn't see him approaching, and he watched her in silence for a few moments. The effort and dedication in her movements were clear. Christopher felt a mix of admiration and guilt. He had spent so much time focused only on his own success that he had never stopped to recognize the efforts of those who worked for him. "Grace," he called finally. She looked up, surprised, and quickly stood up, wiping her hands on her uniform. "Mr. Evans," she said, a little awkwardly. "I didn't know you were here. I was just passing by." Christopher replied with a friendly smile. "How are things going?" "I'm adjusting," Grace replied with a shy smile. "The work is hard, but I'm doing my best." Christopher observed her for a moment, noticing the exhaustion in her eyes but also the determination in her posture. Grace was facing much more than physical work. The prejudice from her coworkers was still a constant shadow in her life. Christopher knew that changing the way people viewed her wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to help her in some way. In the days that followed, Christopher began to think of ways to support Grace and other employees who faced difficult situations. He realized that he had neglected the human side of his business for too long. With this in mind, he called a meeting with his managers to discuss an idea that had been forming in his mind for some time. "I've been thinking a lot about how we deal with our employees," he began. "Up until now, we've focused on numbers and results, but we're forgetting the people. I believe we need to offer more growth opportunities to those who work with us. I want to implement a program to incentivize education and professional development. The managers exchanged surprised glances at Christopher's change in attitude. He had always been a practical man, focused on financial results. But now he seemed to be prioritizing something different. The idea of investing in the personal development of employees was met with a mix of enthusiasm and skepticism. However, Christopher was determined. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he had to start with those who were around him every day. As the program began to be implemented, Grace continued her journey of overcoming obstacles. She still faced prejudice, but little by little, her co-workers began to notice her dedication and effort. Her firm and determined stance helped her face the adversities, and slowly, she began to earn the respect of those around her. Each workday was another opportunity for Grace to prove her worth, and she did so with the same determination since day one. Grace's progress at work was evident. Her dedication and focus were finally starting to pay off. The co-workers who had previously treated her with suspicion began to recognize her effort. Although some prejudice still existed, the resistance was decreasing. Grace, however, knew that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. She was grateful for the opportunity Christopher had given her, but she knew the hard work was just beginning. Still, the future was starting to look more promising than ever. It was during this moment of transformation that Grace received unexpected news. One afternoon, at the end of a long workday, she received a call from an unknown number. She answered, unaware of the impact that call would have. "Hello?" she said, trying to sound calm. The voice on the other end was low, almost hesitant. "Grace, I know where your husband is." The words froze Grace in place. She had always wondered what had happened to her husband since he disappeared, but the lack of answers had eaten away at her. Now, someone was telling her he was alive, and it caught her completely off guard. What was she supposed to feel? Relief? Anger? Grace's heart raced as she tried to process the information. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The person on the other end of the line hesitated before responding. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that he's alive and wants to talk to you." Grace felt the ground slip from beneath her feet. Alive. For months, she had lived in uncertainty, not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead. Now suddenly he reappeared as if nothing had happened. But along with the relief came a wave of anger. How could he leave her alone, without explanations, with a baby to raise? The questions started piling up in her mind. "Where is he?" Grace asked, with a mix of urgency and anger. "We can arrange a meeting if you're willing to see him," said the mysterious voice. Grace remained silent for a moment, trying to control the emotions that were overwhelming her. Part of her wanted answers, but another part was furious. How could he disappear without a trace, leaving her alone to deal with everything? She needed this meeting, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy. "Tell me when and where," she finally responded firmly. The call ended, and Grace stood still, with the phone still in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. Her husband was alive and wanted to see her. The emotions left her reeling. What could she expect from this meeting? Somehow it would change her life again. The next day, Grace went to work as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. She tried to focus on her daily tasks, but thoughts of her husband consumed her. What would he say? How could he justify his abandonment? And what would she do from here? As she struggled to maintain her concentration, she crossed paths with Christopher in the hallway. He, always observant, noticed that something was wrong. "Is everything okay, Grace?" he asked with a tone of concern. Grace hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to talk about it, but she felt she could trust Christopher. "I got a call yesterday," she began slowly. "My husband is alive. He wants to see me." Christopher was surprised but said nothing for a moment. Grace's story with her husband was complicated, and his disappearance had caused immense pain. "And what are you going to do?" he asked carefully. "I don't know," Grace admitted, her voice full of uncertainty. part of me wants answers, but another part is furious. He left me alone with our child. And now, suddenly, he wants to show up? Christopher looked at her with empathy. How difficult that situation must have been for her. Whatever your decision, I'll be here to support you, he said sincerely. Grace felt momentary relief upon hearing those words. Knowing that she had someone to count on at that moment made her feel less alone. She thanked Christopher with a slight smile, but she was still full of uncertainties about what would come next. The meeting with her husband would be the turning point she both feared and longed for. Her life would change again, but she didn't know in what way. On the scheduled day, Grace prepared herself for the meeting with her husband. She was nervous and didn't know what to expect. She had spent months without any news of him, unsure whether he was alive or dead. Now she would finally get the answers she had long sought. She couldn't stop imagining what he would say. The idea of seeing him again after so long filled her with a mix of relief and anger. She wondered if he would have a valid justification for what he had done or if all she would hear were empty excuses. She arrived at the agreed location, a small cafe away from the city center. As she entered, her eyes quickly found the familiar figure sitting in a corner. He looked different. He was thinner, with a face marked by the time and hardships he had surely endured. Grace took a deep breath and approached, sitting in front of him without saying a word. The silence between them was heavy. The tension in the air was palpable. Grace waited for him to speak first, but was also prepared for whatever he would say. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling, "thank you for coming." She looked at him with a cold expression she never imagined she could feel for someone she once loved deeply. She felt like she no longer knew this man, and yet everything about him was so familiar. There was a tremendous weight in being there, facing him after all this time. "I need answers," she said firmly. "Why did you leave me? Why did you abandon our son?" The man lowered his head, clearly ashamed. There was much to explain, and he didn't know where to start. He wanted to justify himself, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. Every second of silence between them was heavy, and he realized that no explanation could undo what he had done. He couldn't just come back and pretend everything was fine. "I was involved in some complicated things," he began hesitantly. "My life was in danger, and I thought that by disappearing, I'd be protecting you and our son." Grace stared at him, trying to process those words. He had left them out of fear? He abandoned his family without even asking for help? The feeling of anger grew inside her. It was hard to believe that he had made such a drastic decision without giving her a chance to understand what was happening. "And you thought the best way to protect us was to leave us alone?" she asked, trying to hold back her tears. "You left me with nothing? No explanation, without even knowing if you were alive or dead." He shook his head, his expression full of regret. "I made a lot of mistakes, Grace. I know that. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want you to know the truth. I was weak. I didn't know how to handle the situation." Grace looked at him for a few more seconds, her anger mixed with sadness. The man before her was the same one who had once been her partner, but now he seemed like a stranger. What hurt the most wasn't just the fact that he had left, but that at no point had he trusted her to face the problems together. "I don't know if I can forgive you for that," she finally said. "You left a wound that may never heal. I moved on for me and for our son. You show up now expecting what? For everything to go back to normal?" Grace continued, her voice filled with hurt. The silence between them grew even heavier. Grace's husband looked down, unable to face her pain. There weren't enough words to undo what he had done, and the regret weighed heavily on his shoulders. But he also knew it was too late to fix the past. "I don't know, Grace," he finally said, his voice weak. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know what happened and why I did what I did. I thought I was protecting you and our son, but I understand now it was the worst decision I could have made. And now I just want to try and make things right if that's even possible." Grace felt a mix of confused emotions. part of her wanted to believe his words, but the pain and anger were still too strong to be ignored. She thought of all the nights she had spent alone, not knowing if he was alive or dead, without support, without anyone to help her. The man in front of her was no longer the person she had married, and the future they had planned together had crumbled. "And what do you think is going to happen now?" Grace asked, her voice firm. "Do you think you can just come back and be part of our lives like nothing ever happened? Because I don't know if I can let that happen. I had to fend for myself, had to be strong for me and for our son. And now, I'm finally finding my way. I'm rebuilding my life. I can't just go back." He looked at her with a mix of regret and desperation. Grace was right. He had destroyed the trust between them, and there might be no way to fix that. But even so, he needed to try. "I know I messed everything up," he said, his voice filled with pain. "I know you don't need me, that you managed to move forward without my help. But I'd like to be present somehow, at least for our son. He deserves to have his father around, even though I failed as a husband." Grace remained silent for a moment, considering his words. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. As much as she wanted to keep him out of her life, her son had the right to know his father. But there was still so much pain in all of this, and Grace wasn't ready to deal with the complicated situation. "Maybe someday you can be part of our son's life," Grace finally said, her voice firm but with a certain softness. "But for now, I need to keep going with my life. I can't let you mess things up again. I have a path now, something I'm building for me and for him, and I can't go back to the past." Grace's husband nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. She was right, and he had no right to ask for more than that. Grace stood up from the table, ready to end the conversation and move on. She had gotten the answers she was looking for, but that didn't change the fact that her future no longer included him. "I hope you can find your way too," Grace said before leaving the cafe. "But for now, I need to follow mine." She walked away without looking back, feeling the weight of a new chapter in her life beginning. Though the pain was still there, along with the anger and regret, she was finally ready to leave the past behind and focus on the future she wanted to build. In the days that followed the meeting with her husband, Grace experienced a complex mix of emotions. There was no doubt that the secret behind his disappearance had been revealed, but the closure she had hoped for didn't come with the relief she had imagined. Instead, she found herself having to accept what she couldn't change and move forward with a new perspective. Christopher, always attentive, noticed the subtle changes in Grace. She had found her husband and understood the reasons for his disappearance, but he didn't ask for details. He preferred to give her space, believing she would approach him if she wanted to share. His respect for Grace had grown immensely since that first day in the park. To him, it wasn't just about a desperate mother in need of help. It was about a woman who had faced abandonment, prejudice, and adversity, yet still maintained her dignity and perseverance. As time went on, Grace's life began to stabilize. The baby, who once seemed so helpless, was now taking his first steps, while she, in parallel, was solidifying her role within Christopher's company. The decision not to reconcile with her husband, as difficult as it was, had been liberating. Grace realized that life didn't offer guarantees, but with resilience and determination, she could shape her future. At work, the suspicious glances and hurtful comments finally began to disappear. Grace's dedication, humility, and the way she faced prejudice eventually won over her coworkers. Slowly, she became recognized as someone who truly deserved to be there, not just someone who had been given the job as a favor. Over time, this positive perception became firmly established. Thanks to the incentive program Christopher had created, inspired by her story, Grace had the chance to expand her horizons. She began studying business management, determined to build a solid career and secure a stable future for her and her son. Her rise within the company came naturally. From a cleaning assistant, she started helping with administrative tasks, and over time, she gained the trust of her supervisors, eventually being promoted to a leadership role in the operations team. Christopher, observing this growth firsthand, also underwent his own transformation. The man who once believed that success was measured only by wealth and power now understood the true value of the people around him. His fortune, once seen as a symbol of personal achievement, now became a tool to improve the lives of his employees. He had rediscovered, through grace, the impact that a simple gesture of empathy and solidarity could have. One day, while reviewing some reports in his office, Christopher looked out the window and saw Grace, now a leader of his team, talking animatedly with some employees. There was something inspiring about that scene. He remembered the day he had found her in the park, exhausted and desperate, pushing a baby stroller. The transformation she had undergone was extraordinary, but even more impressive was the effect she had on him and his company. Grace wasn't the only employee with a story of overcoming adversity. Many of his workers came from difficult backgrounds, battling hardships, yet still making an effort every day to improve their lives. The incentive program he had implemented had not only benefited Grace but other employees as well, giving them the opportunity to thrive. This filled him with pride, not just for the success of the company, but for the real impact he now felt he was having on people's lives. At an end-of-year meeting, Christopher decided it was time to publicly express his gratitude. Standing before a room full of employees, he delivered a speech that surprised everyone. "When I started this company," he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion, "my goal was to build something great. I believed success was measured in numbers, in financial achievements. And for many years, that's how I lived. But in recent times, I've learned something far more valuable. I've learned that true success isn't about how much money you have in the bank, but in the lives you can transform with that money." Grace, sitting quietly in a corner of the room, felt tears well up in her eyes. Those words weren't just for all the employees, but in a way, they were a tribute to the path she had walked. She felt immense gratitude for having been part of this change. "A very special person taught me this," Christopher continued without mentioning names directly, though everyone knew the story. "And today, more than ever, I understand that our greatest wealth lies in people, in their stories, their struggles, and, above all, in their triumphs. I'm proud of all of you, for everything we've built together, and for everything we will still achieve." Applause echoed through the room, and Grace, her heart warmed, felt fulfilled. Her journey, from that desperate morning in the park to this moment, had been arduous, but she had never regretted her decisions. Refusing Christopher's initial charity and insisting on working for herself was what, in the end, gave her not just a career but a new life, a purpose. In the months that followed, Grace continued to rise within the company. She became one of the key leaders in the operations team, respected and admired by all. Her story of overcoming inspired other employees, many of whom began enrolling in the educational incentive programs. Grace made it a point to help, advise, and motivate those who, like her, were facing personal challenges. As for Christopher, he never looked at his fortune the same way again. His encounter with Grace in the park had changed his life in a profound and irreversible way. He had not only become a more compassionate leader, but he had also found a purpose he hadn't seen before, using his wealth to transform lives, just as Grace had transformed his. In the end, both came out of that encounter transformed. For Grace, the future now looked promising, her path full of possibilities. For Christopher, the fortune that had once seemed his greatest treasure became a tool for transformation. And for both of them, that moment in the park, which seemed like a coincidence, turned out to be the starting point for something much greater, a life full of purpose.